Chapter 64. Settling Down. Late 1940s. Over Chilly River spout H, saying for a pregnancy, she was showing to be over Chilly River. Earl and Emily Ruff Vale had met at Prairie View Baptist Church and married on October 19, 1946. Kenneth James Vale, Jr. was 2 years old when they married. Earl wanted a minister that lived in Marshall to marry them, so they went there for a private ceremony. Preacher A.M. Kimbrell was involved with the New Hope Missionary Baptist Church that met at the Cooper Schoolhouse when the Riley Harness family had lived on Bear Creek. The couple went to the home of Reverend Kimbrell, where his wife stood in the background by a stove. She was cleaning, making her hands black from the soot. The short ceremony was witnessed by Perry Harness and Emma Ray Horton. When it was completed and the licenses signed, Earl had forgotten his wallet, and it was up to Emily to pay the $5 for the service. They later laughed with the retelling of Emily paying for her wedding. Together, Earl and Emily had already bought an 80-acre farm prior to their marriage for $11,500 from Ellis Sanders on May 13, 1946, with cash. Earl had saved up money, and Emily had received some life insurance money from her husband's death in the war. The newlyweds spent their first night together in the farmhouse they now owned. Mrs. Sanders baked a chicken in the oven for them to eat. The couple not only bought the farm and its house, but its furniture and some basic housewares as well. The old saying, lock, stock, and barrel, seems to have applied. Sometime later, Earl took Emily for a brief honeymoon at Rockaway Beach near Forsyth, Missouri. It was a popular spot on the shores of Lake Taneycomo. That same year, a couple named Hugo and Mary Hershend from Chicago visited the area. They leased a cave and later in 1960 opened a single street of shops with a stagecoach ride and called the place Silver Dollar City. Several of the Harnesses went to the newly opened venue on an outing. I recall going and hoping to get a silver dollar. Earl took a job working for Woodrow Magnus, who was the John Deere Equipment and Buick car dealer in Harrison. He was frustrated by the owner's refusal to bargain with buyers, insisting that the selling price was final. Earl missed sales that were within a few dollars of selling, and so he eventually quit. Yet he would remain a loyal John Deere owner throughout most of his life, and he drove Buick cars for many years. Charles Clifford Harness and his wife Mary were working and living in a small trailer, moving it from place to place. Clee built power lines in the delta of Arkansas near Helena. While the Harness family was still living near Bellefonte on the farm, Clee and Mary decided to move to Bellefonte and be near his family. For a short while, they lived near the town, and then for a few weeks, they moved their trailer to the farm where Earl and Emily Harness lived. They parked the trailer under a large oak tree that was just outside the yard fence of the house on the south side. Then a house owned by Mr. Clinton Arnold became available down the road from his brother Earl's farm, and Clee moved his family into the small farmhouse. While living in the Arnold house, young Danny Ray Harness was upset at his mother over a squabble he had with her. He took some coal oil and threw it on the side of the house and lit it on fire. Fortunately, the small fire was extinguished, and Danny got into big trouble when his pa came home that evening. I recall this story being told by my brother Kenneth when a few years later we walked by the abandoned old house. He pointed to the black charred boards of the porch where Danny had attempted his inferno of fury. Mr. Clinton Arnold owned several acres of property adjoining the farm of Earl and Emily Harness. He never married, and the Harness family thought highly of him as a neighbor. He offered to sell a portion of land to Riley Harness, which included a farmhouse and barn. Riley and Melinda decided to sell their Bellefonte farm and move closer to their son, Earl. The Arnold farm was 77 acres, and the two-story house had room for the family. It had been wired for electric lights but had no plumbing. Water was drawn from a cistern that stored rainwater from the roof and caught with eave troughs that emptied into the well. I remember the water tasting different than our well water. An outhouse and chicken coop with a smokehouse and cellar were located behind the farmhouse. Leroy Clinton Arnold is buried in the Crossroads Cemetery on Prairie View Road. I was 4 years old and attended the funeral with my mother. The funeral parlor was on Main Street in Harrison, which today is the parking lot of Hudson Grocery. I still remember seeing Mr. Arnold in his casket and asking my mother about it. It is my first recollection of seeing the dead and being curious about it. When they lowered Mr. Arnold's coffin in the ground at the cemetery, I had more questions for my mom about that. The Arnold farm was once part of Baker Prairie. A large post oak tree in the middle of the acreage attests to hundreds of years of growth, with limbs spreading into the open space. The tree today is approaching 400 years of seeing changes brought by fencing and farming. Riley made the transition from horse to tractor while farming on the new place. His John Deere tractor was known as a Johnny Popper due to the unique sound of the two-cylinder combustion motor. It had rubber tires and a large flywheel used for starting the engine and for auxiliary power. One of my earliest memories with Grandpa was riding on his Johnny Popper and him letting me steer it. Both Riley and Earl farmed together, each owning a Johnny Pop tractor. Earl and Riley were cutting hay on the creek for a neighbor. When it was time to rake up the hay, Riley made the first swath around the field, but got too close to the bank of the creek. His tractor went over, and he jumped as it flipped into the water. Earl noticed Riley was missing and went looking for him. Finding his dad okay, they retrieved the popper from the creek, and fortunately, little was hurt, so they continued their work. Together, the two of them helped each other farm and sometimes do custom work for hire with their equipment. Putting up hay was one of the biggest chores on the farm. Harvesting grass and keeping it dry was the goal. But you were at the mercy of the weather in late spring when it was time to make hay. Using a sickle mower, a bull rake, and a peckerwood baler allowed loose hay to be made into square bales. Earl's big barn, built in 1942, was set up for storing loose hay, having a hoist and a trolley with large hay forks. Loose hay storage required a lot of handwork, but Earl soon purchased more modern equipment to bale hay for himself and his dad. Reva Jane Harness was 15 years old when Earl and Emily married. She grew to be a strong young woman with exceptional strength. Dressed in men's coveralls and a straw hat, Reva would help with the farm chores. She would milk the cows, and when it was time to bale or haul hay, she worked right alongside any man. Reva needed supervision, as she tended to get distracted and forget what she was supposed to be doing. If she messed something up, she tried to hide it. When she broke a dish in the kitchen, if it went unnoticed, she would bury it in the backyard. Years later, when a septic tank was added, several broken dishes were discovered. It was sort of like an archaeological dig telling the story of the past. On a particularly hot day, Earl and Riley were making hay, and Reva, Roy, and James were working as well. The hay field was on Earl's farm in the southwest corner. Riley was raking the hay into piles with the bull rake. Earl and his brothers were moving the peckerwood baler from pile to pile where they would pitch the hay, feeding the hay baler, which was powered by a belt from the auxiliary flywheel of the Johnny Popper. There was a lot of handwork involved to make a square bale, but it was a much more convenient way to store and feed hay. The peckerwood baler required someone to feed it hay in the right amounts to keep it operating without overstuffing it. If it was fed too much hay, it would stop, and the belt would squeal as it slipped. Earl was busy feeding it hay, and Reva was assigned to call out, "Block it," when the bale was the proper length of about 35 inches. The hand clutch on the tractor was disengaged, stopping the belt from turning, and a wood block was placed in the bale chamber to create a space where wire ties could be inserted and tied off, making a wire-tied square bale of hay. The used baling wire was the farmer's go-to repair for many things. Before there was duct tape, there was baling wire. In the heat of this operation, Reva was to call for a block when the bale was the proper length, but she was sleeping on the job. She called out, "Brocket," and Earl discovered that the hay bale was far beyond its terminal length. This meant that the hay now had to be fed back through and redone. Earl was hot and mad about her carelessness and shouted to her in his disgust, "You'd say brocket," after it was a mile long. The slur, brocket, was about Reva's speech impediment and was deliberately Earl's way of letting off some steam. As he turned to go back toward his work, he heard a whizzing sound go past his ear as he watched a pair of wire pliers land beyond him. He had narrowly escaped the wrath of his sister, who was attempting to plant her pliers in the back of his head. When Earl saw what she had tried to do to him, he turned and decided to wrestle Reva to the ground. As they locked arms in the tussle, Earl discovered how strong his sister was. He was barely able to take her down, and once he did, he found it most difficult to hold her. Upon deciding he had bitten off more than he could chew, Earl let her up. There was no time for settling differences, as they needed to be making hay. I can't imagine what was going through Riley and the boys' heads watching Earl and Reva in a wrestling match. But in later years, this story was told over and over and remembered with the words, "Brocket." I recall Kenneth saying that he had helped haul hay with Reva, and she could buck a bale of hay like any man. Reva would never marry and remained with Riley and Melinda until their death. Emily was carrying her second child in 1947, and on September the 2nd, it was time to get the doctor. Dr. Ross Fowler was making house calls and delivering babies, as there was no hospital in the county. Earl said he felt comfortable assisting the doctor, and having Lenny Ruff, Emily's mother, there also must have eased her worry some. Earl said that when the baby was coming, he administered ether to help Emily with the pain. Ether is a pleasant-smelling, colorless, volatile liquid that is highly flammable. It is used as an anesthetic to induce insensitivity to pain. Gary Lee Harness was introduced to his family in the house where he would grow up. Back on Bear Creek in Searcy County, the last recorded church service at the Cooper Schoolhouse, where the New Hope Missionary Baptist Church met, was dated October 12, 1947, where on Sunday the Reverend J.D. Rose preached his sermon from the book of Romans chapter 1. The record says, "There weren't very many members here because most everyone was gone to the cotton patch. There was over $10 collection for the Reverend Rose. The small congregation would consolidate with the Canaan Missionary Baptist soon thereafter. At the Prairie View Missionary Baptist Church near Harrison, in the spring of 1947, it was noted in the church record that the request for a letter of transfer of membership from the Bear Creek New Hope Missionary Baptist Church for Riley Harness and some family members had never been received. The issue was that the church had been disbanded, so they were received by statement. Brother Wade Rambo was the pastor at Prairie View at that time. In Newton County on February 6, 1948, a B-25 crashed into Round Top Mountain near Jasper, Arkansas, killing 5 airmen. Conditions that evening were rainy, foggy, and cold, with some ice. Around 8:00 p.m., folks at a local basketball game first heard the low-flying plane and then a loud explosion that shook the windows. The wreckage was never removed after the Air Force investigated the site. Today, a public trail takes you to the site, and an engine from the plane is displayed. On the same mountain on June 5, 1980, a tour charter bus lost control and crashed, killing 20 passengers and injuring 13 at a place locals called Suicide Curve, due to the many wrecks happening there. The age of the automobile and airplane had brought many advances to the Ozarks, but it also had its dangers in the scenic and rugged mountain terrain. Reflection. Riley and Melinda Harness helped many of their relatives relocate to the Harrison area over the years. Keeping their children and grandchildren near them continued a legacy of closeness and faith. The ravages of war and economic depression would be washed over by the flood of prosperity and progress, as many grandchildren would also be added. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will cause your enemies who rise against you to be defeated before your face. They shall come out against you one way and flee before you 7 ways. The Lord will command the blessing on you in your storehouses and in all to which you set your hand, and he will bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Deuteronomy 28:7-8.